common question from students is whether there is a general recipe or method to making sure that you are computing the consumer surplus correctly. And this is particularly important in situations like the ones that we have studied in this unit, in which the consumer may be facing a tax or a subsidy, or the economic general constraints that he faces are somewhat complicated. So here is the way I advise you to think about it. And the basic advice is you should go back to basics. So let's remember a couple of things. Suppose that you're in a situation theta, and remember that is a description of economic constraints. What are the economic constraints or defining the consumer problem? And you want to compute, you want CS of theta, okay? Let me define two objects for you. One is going to be X star, and I'm going to put here consumed at theta, which is the amount consumed at the situation once the subject does the behavior. Now the other one is X star bought at theta, which is the amount bought by the consumer. Now these two things are often the same, but there are situations in which they are not. Consider, as we have seen in some examples, what happens if, for example, for every unit you buy, you get a free unit. Then X consumed is equal to twice X bought. This is just some notation that is going to help us. Now, what do I mean by going back to basics? Remember, what is the definition of the consumer surplus at theta? Literally, the definition is what is the utility that you get at the allocation generated by theta. Let me call that X star of theta. And this is what you consume minus, based on what you consume, minus the utility of no trade. And remember that the utility of no trade, X is equal to 0 and M is equal to your wealth. So, how do we compute the consumer surplus? Well, one option is, if you know the utility function, is just to substitute in this formula what this looks like, and this is just going to be the benefit of whatever you end up consuming at theta minus, and this is important, sorry, plus W minus, and this is the key tricky part sometimes, the cost of the consumption of X star consumed of theta. And sometimes this is the price times what you buy, but depending on other policies, whether there are tax, whether there are subsidies, whether there are matching programs, it may be something else. So just think is, what is the cost, the total cost that the consumer himself pays to get that? And all of this term is this first part. And then we have subtract the utility of no trade, which is just B of 0 plus W. These two cancel. This is a lot of the time 0, although not all the time. Maybe. And then what we get is just the B of X star consumed at theta minus the cost of obtaining that, and if necessary, minus B of 0, of getting nothing. Sorry, there's a parenthesis here. So that is the basic formula. Now, one thing that often causes confusion among students also is how to relate this general recipe for computing CS with the formula of consumer surplus as the integral under the inverse demand function that we have studied. So let's look at that carefully. From the previous slide, we see that consumer surplus at theta, sorry, is equal to the benefit at X star consumed at theta minus the cost of getting that consumption minus this B0 term that may or may not be 0. Now let's think about how to compute that as an integral. Suppose for a second that you knew what the marginal benefit function was. You knew this, and you knew it because you know what B is, or you observe, for example, as we have been seeing, the inverse demand function under free trade, as we have been seeing, just trade at price P. So suppose that you knew this. Then the question is, how can we rewrite this using the integral? Well, we know that this term, and this is the first thing I'm going to do, is going to be B0 plus the integral from 0 to X star consumed under theta under the marginal benefit function. So basically all of that area. So the integral from 0 to x star consume theta under that area, which is b prima of x dx. That is just that term. Then what else do we have to do? We have to subtract the cost of getting that consumption, and then we have subtract minus b0. Notice that this term and this term cancel, and what we get is this integral term minus the cost term. That's a general formula that you can count on every time. As long as you get the consume behavior correctly and you know what b prime is, it will lead you to the right answer. Just so you check your intuition that this formula makes sense, think for a second about what this formula tells you in the case of free trade. It's telling you to integrate from 0 to the amount demanded at price P of the area under the marginal benefit function minus the cost of getting that, which is just minus P times the amount demanded. And that's exactly the formula of consumer surplus that we have derived before.